I never thought I'd be the guy typing his life story into a forum for strangers to read. But when your world implodes at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, you realize you don't have as many friends as you thought you did. Actually, let me rephrase that. You realize the one friend you would have taken a bullet for was the one holding the gun the entire time. My name is Mark. I'm 32, I work in corporate logistics management here in Chicago, and up until about 3 months ago, I thought I had the textbook definition of the American dream. I had a beautiful wife named Sarah, a 3-bedroom house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb just outside the city, a decent retirement account, and a golden retriever named Buster who was always waiting by the front door when I got home. I also had a best friend named Todd. Todd and I went back to our freshman year at Ohio State. We survived the shared dorm bathrooms, the terrible campus food, the brutal breakups, and the late-night cram sessions fueled by cheap energy drinks and cold pizza. When I moved to Chicago for my career, Todd followed a year later. We were inseparable. He was the best man at my wedding. When Sarah and I bought our first house, Todd was there with a truck and a case of beer, helping us carry heavy oak dressers up a narrow flight of stairs without scratching the drywall. He was family. If you had told me back then that Todd would become the architect of my complete and utter destruction, I would have laughed in your face and bought you another drink. But that's the thing about betrayal. It never comes from your enemies. It always comes from the people you let sleep under your roof. It all started back in November. Todd had been working in commercial real estate, a high-stakes, commission-only environment that was incredibly volatile. He had a bad quarter, got involved with some risky investments, and before he knew it, his landlord was threatening eviction on his downtown loft. He called me one Thursday night from a sports bar, his voice thick with a mixture of alcohol and pure panic. He didn't ask for money. Todd was too proud for that. But he asked if he could crash on our basement couch for a couple of weeks, just until he closed a new listing and could get first and last month's rent together for a new place. I didn't even hesitate. I didn't even consult Sarah first, which was my first mistake, though she was incredibly understanding when I told her. She knew how much Todd meant to me. She agreed that we couldn't let him drown. The first few weeks were completely normal. Todd moved in with 2 suitcases and a garment bag full of his work suits. He kept the basement impeccably clean, helped out with the dishes, and would regularly buy groceries or cook dinner for us on the weekends. It felt like a throwback to our college days, just with better wine and a mortgage. He and Sarah had always gotten along well, but with him living in our house, they naturally became closer. They'd sit at the kitchen island in the mornings, drinking coffee and talking about interior design or local politics, while I was rushing out the door to beat the morning rush hour traffic on the I-90. I was happy about it. I loved the idea that my wife and my best friend were forming a genuine, independent bond. I thought it made our little circle stronger. But weeks turned into 2 months, and then 3. The real estate market was slow, or at least that's what Todd kept telling me. I noticed a subtle shift in the household dynamic around late January. It wasn't anything blatant at first, just an accumulation of tiny, barely perceptible micro-moments that you only recognize in hindsight once the blindfold is ripped off. It was the way the room would suddenly get quiet when I walked into the kitchen after taking a work call in the den. It was the way Sarah started dressing up a bit more, even on days when she was just working from home. She was a freelance graphic designer, so her usual uniform was leggings and an oversized college sweatshirt. Suddenly, she was wearing nice jeans, subtle makeup, and perfumes I hadn't smelled since our anniversary. When I complimented her, she'd just shrug it off and say she was trying to feel more productive. Then came the travel schedule. My company started restructuring our Midwest distribution hubs, which meant I had to spend 3 days a week traveling between Indianapolis, Detroit, and Cleveland. I hated being away from home, but the silver lining was that I knew Sarah wasn't alone. I literally told her the night before my first major trip how relieved I was that Todd was staying with us so she wouldn't feel lonely in the big house by herself. I remember she looked down at her plate, tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, and said, "Yeah, it's definitely nice having the extra company." I kissed her forehead, packed my Toomey suitcase, and left at 5 a.m. the next morning, completely oblivious to the fact that I was handing over the keys to my kingdom. Over the next month, the distance between Sarah and me grew into a chasm. When I called her from my hotel rooms in the evening, the conversations felt forced, transactional, and exhausting. She was always tired, or about to go to bed, or in the middle of a movie. I'd ask how her day was, and she'd give me short, vague answers. When I asked about Todd, she'd say he was out late with clients or working in the basement. Conversely, whenever I texted Todd to check in, he was equally distant. He stopped sending me memes, stopped asking how my trips were going, and stopped talking about sports. I attributed all of it to stress. I was stressed from travel, Sarah was stressed from her workload, Todd was stressed about his finances. I kept telling myself that once this corporate restructuring was over in March, things would go back to normal. The breaking point happened on a cold, dreary Tuesday in mid-February. I was supposed to be in Detroit until Thursday evening. I had checked into the Marriott, completed my afternoon site inspections, and was preparing for a long dinner with the regional managers. But at around 1 p.m., my VP called me into an impromptu Zoom meeting and informed me that the Detroit project was being put on an immediate hold due to a compliance issue. My presence was no longer required. I was free to go home. My first instinct was to call Sarah and surprise her, but then I thought about how romantic it would be to just show up unannounced. I imagined walking through the front door, seeing her face light up, and taking her out to that expensive Italian restaurant downtown that we hadn't been to in over a year. I checked out of the hotel, loaded my rental car, and drove the 4 hours back to Chicago. The drive was long, gray, and monotonous, but the closer I got to the city, the more excited I became. I stopped at a boutique florist near our suburban exit and bought a massive arrangement of eucalyptus and deep red roses, her absolute favorite. It was exactly 3:15 p.m. when I pulled into our driveway. The sky was overcast, spitfiring a miserable mix of sleet and rain. I noticed Todd's BMW was parked in the driveway instead of its usual spot on the street. I figured he was just working from home because of the weather. I unlocked the front door quietly, stepping into the warmth of the foyer. The house was dead silent, except for the faint, muffled sound of music coming from upstairs. It was a slow, ambient playlist that Sarah usually listened to when she was relaxing. I smiled to myself, setting my heavy briefcase down by the coat rack, holding the flowers carefully in my right hand. I walked past the kitchen, noticing 2 empty wine glasses sitting in the sink, stained with a dark Pinot Noir. That struck me as slightly odd for a Tuesday afternoon, but I brushed it off. Maybe they had a glass with lunch. I started walking up the carpeted stairs, my heart beating with a strange sudden spike of nervous energy that I couldn't quite explain. My instincts, deep down in the evolutionary marrow of my bones, were trying to warn me. The music got louder as I reached the second-floor landing. It was coming from our master bedroom. The door was cracked open about 2 inches, a thin sliver of warm light spilling out onto the dark hardwood hallway. I approached the door, my mouth opening to call out her name, but the words died in my throat. Through the 2-inch gap in the doorway, I saw a reflection in the large full-length mirror that hung on the opposite wall of our bedroom. It wasn't a view of my wife reading a book or working on her laptop. It was a view of Todd's back, his broad shoulders moving rhythmically, and beneath him, tangled in our high thread count white linen sheets, was Sarah. Her eyes were closed, her head thrown back, her fingers gripping his shoulders with a fierce, desperate familiarity that she hadn't shown me in years. The world didn't spin. It didn't stop. It shattered. The bouquet of roses slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a soft, dull thud. The sound was minor, but in that quiet house, it sounded like a cannon firing. The movement in the mirror stopped instantly. The silence that followed the drop of those flowers was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. It was like a movie frame had frozen, locking the 3 of us into a grotesque gallery of our own worst versions. Then, the reflection in the mirror shattered as Todd bolted upward, his face draining of whatever color it had left. I didn't push the door open. I didn't storm in like a hero in an action movie. I just stood there in the hallway, looking at the 2 inches of open space, my breathing so shallow I could hear the blood rushing through my ears like a freight train. I heard Sarah gasp, a sharp, choked intake of air that sounded less like fear and more like she had just been plunged into freezing water. "Mark?" Her voice came out as a whisper, terrified and trembling, completely stripped of the confident, independent tone she had been using with me over the phone for the past month. I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I opened my mouth, I felt like I would either scream until my lungs tore or throw up right there on the pristine hardwood. Instead of acting, my body took over on autopilot. I turned around. I walked back down the stairs, each step feeling incredibly heavy, as if gravity had suddenly tripled. My mind was completely blank, yet operating with terrifying clarity. I walked past the kitchen with the 2 wine glasses. I walked into the foyer. I picked up my briefcase, grabbed the handle of my rolling suitcase, and walked right back out into the freezing Chicago sleet. I got into my car, slammed the door, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so violently against the leather steering wheel that I could barely slot the transmission into reverse. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked up at the second-floor window. The sheer curtains moved. I couldn't see her clearly through the rain-streaked glass, but I knew she was standing there, watching me leave. I drove down our street, past the neat suburban lawns, past the families and the neighbors who thought we were the perfect young couple, and pulled into the parking lot of a local diner about 2 miles away. I parked in the farthest corner, killed the lights, and just sat there in the dark. That's when the shock began to wear off, and the physical reality of what I had just witnessed hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I leaned over the center console and wept. It wasn't just crying. It was a deep, primal sobbing that made my ribs ache. The images kept flashing behind my eyelids every time I closed them. Todd, Sarah, my bed, the house I paid for, the friend I saved from financial ruin, the woman I had promised to love and protect until the day I died. It was a perfect, multi-layered betrayal that attacked every single pillar of my identity. I wasn't just a cheated-on husband. I was a fooled friend, a clueless benefactor, an idiot who had literally paved the highway for his own execution. My phone started buzzing in my pocket. It was Sarah. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it buzzed again. Todd. I stared at his name on the glowing screen, the name of the guy who had stood next to me at the altar, holding the rings. I felt a sudden, terrifying surge of pure, unadulterated rage replace the sadness. I wanted to go back. I wanted to grab a golf club from the garage and show him exactly what it felt like to have your life smashed into pieces. But the rational, corporate logistics side of my brain, the part of me that handles crises for a living, forced its way through the fog. Going back meant violence. Violence meant jail. Jail meant losing whatever leverage I had left in this nightmare. I turned the phone on silent and shoved it into the glove box. I needed space. I needed a place where neither of them could find me. I drove into downtown Chicago, checked into a nondescript boutique hotel under my business account, and walked up to a room on the 14th floor. I didn't unpack. I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the city skyline outside the window as the afternoon bled into a dark, stormy evening. By 7 p.m., the text messages started piling up. I opened my laptop and logged into our shared cellular account to read them without sending read receipts. Sarah's texts went through the classic stages of grief and panic. Mark, please come home. It's not what it looks like. Please let me explain. I am so sorry. Oh my God, Mark, please just text me back so I know you're safe. It's funny how people always say it's not what it looks like, when it is exactly, mathematically, precisely what it looked like. There was no context on earth that justified my best friend being in our bed while I was out of town. Then came Todd's messages. His were different. They were shorter, calculated, defensive. Dude, I am so sorry. I completely crossed a line. It was a mistake. We were both drinking and things got out of hand. Please don't do anything crazy. Let's talk like adults. The phrase, things got out of hand, made me laugh out loud in the empty hotel room, a bitter, hollow sound. Falling down the stairs is something getting out of hand. Tripping and spilling coffee is an accident. What they did required weeks of orchestration, hundreds of glances, text messages, secret schedules, and a complete lack of empathy for the guy paying the mortgage. As the night wore on, the anger hardened into a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. I realized I couldn't stay in that hotel room forever. Tomorrow was Wednesday, and I had to face reality. More importantly, I had to secure my life before they could dismantle whatever was left of it. I knew how divorce worked in Illinois. It could get messy, and since Sarah was a freelancer with an irregular income, I was staring down the barrel of significant financial loss if I didn't handle this with surgical precision. I called a family law attorney whom my corporate counsel had recommended a year ago during a casual conversation about estate planning. His name was Arthur, a sharp, no-nonsense guy in his late 50s who sounded like he had seen every dirty trick the human race had to offer. I summarized the situation in 3 sentences. I didn't cry, I didn't complain about the emotional pain, I just gave him the logistics. Arthur was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Mark," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I'm sorry you're dealing with this, but right now your emotions are your biggest enemy. Do not go back to the house to confront them. Do not send any angry texts. Do not threaten either of them. If you text Todd that you're going to kill him, his lawyer will use that to get a restraining order and kick you out of your own property legally. Tomorrow morning, you come to my office at 9 o'clock. We draft the petition. But before you do that, you need to secure your financial data. Do you have access to her business accounts and your shared lines?" "Yes," I muttered, staring at the hotel wall. "Good. Download the call logs. Download the bank statements. Check for any unusual withdrawals or expenses over the last 3 months. We need a paper trail. If he was living there rent-free and using your resources while conducting an affair with your wife, it changes the narrative around marital asset dissipation. Go to sleep, Mark. Don't drink. See you at 9. I hung up the phone. I didn't sleep. I spent the entire night pulling data, and what I found in those digital files proved that the betrayal didn't start on Tuesday afternoon. It had been happening right under my nose, a slow-burning poison that they had been feeding me for months. Sitting at that small hotel desk at 3 in the morning, bathed in the harsh white light of my laptop screen, I felt like a detective investigating the murder of my own life. I started with the shared cell phone bills. Because I was the primary account holder, I had full access to the itemized call and text logs spanning back the last 6 months. I exported the data into a spreadsheet and ran a simple filter for Todd's number. The results were staggering. The sheer volume of communication between them was a physical weight on my chest. Hundreds of texts every single day. They were texting while I was sitting across from them at the dinner table. They were texting while I was driving to the airport. But the real knife to the gut came when I cross-referenced the timestamps with my own calendar. Every single time I boarded a flight for Detroit, Indianapolis, or Cleveland, a text message went from Sarah's phone to Todd's within 10 minutes of my wheels leaving the tarmac. "He's up in the air. Plane just took off." It wasn't a sudden mistake born out of a weak moment and cheap wine. It was a routine. It was an operation. Then I checked the bank statements. I noticed small, consistent cash withdrawals from our joint checking account over the last 8 weeks, always $50 or $100 at an ATM near a high-end boutique grocery store downtown. Sarah never used cash. I pulled up her credit card statements and found charges for boutique hotels in the city on weekends when I thought she was attending design seminars in Milwaukee. I found a charge for a luxury silk robe purchased at a department store 3 weeks ago. I had never seen it. I realized with a sick certainty that she was wearing it for him in the basement while I was sleeping alone in a Holiday Inn Express in Michigan. By the time the sun began to peek through the Chicago smog, turning the sky a pale, bruised purple, I hadn't slept a single wink. My eyes were bloodshot, my throat dry, but the crushing despair from the day before had entirely evaporated. In its place was a cold, calculating detachment. I showered, put on a fresh suit from my suitcase, and drove down to Arthur's office in the Loop. Arthur's office was exactly what you'd expect from a top-tier family law attorney. Heavy mahogany furniture, shelves lined with leather-bound legal texts, and a view of the elevated train tracks below. He looked at the binder of spreadsheets and bank statements I laid on his desk, flipping through the pages with a practiced, neutral expression. "You did good work last night, Mark," Arthur said, tapping his gold pen against the desk. "This gives us a massive advantage. In Illinois, infidelity itself doesn't legally affect the division of property, but asset dissipation does. She used marital funds to finance an extramarital relationship. More importantly, we have a clear-cut case of an unauthorized long-term occupant in your home who has compromised the safety and integrity of the estate. Here is what we are going to do." He laid out a strategy that felt less like a legal defense and more like a tactical military strike. We were going to file for divorce on the grounds of irretrievable breakdown, but simultaneously file an emergency motion for exclusive possession of the marital residence. Because Todd was living there and creating a hostile environment, and because I had a paper trail proving I was the sole financial provider for the household expenses, Arthur was confident we could get a judge to order both of them out of the house within 48 hours. But you have to maintain complete radio silence until the papers are served, Arthur warned me, leaning forward. No calls, no texts. If they think you're coming back, they might try to clean out the house, hide assets, or worse, fabricate a domestic dispute to get you locked out. Let them think you're still hiding in a hole crying. I left his office at 11 o'clock. The waiting was the hardest part. I drove back to my hotel room and stared at my phone, which was still buzzing intermittently. Sarah had stopped texting excuses and had moved on to frantic checking in. Mark, please, Buster keeps looking for you at the door. He won't eat. Just tell me you're okay. We need to talk about this. Using my dog to guilt trip me was a new low, even for her. Todd had sent one final text at noon. Look, man, I'm packing my stuff and leaving the house today. I don't want to cause any more drama. Let me know where to send my key. I didn't reply. I knew he was lying. A guy who steals your wife doesn't just politely walk away because you caught him. He packs his bags when it's convenient for him. The next morning, Thursday, was D-Day. Arthur's process server, a burly retired sheriff's deputy named Carl, met me at a Starbucks 3 blocks from my house at 2 in the afternoon. Carl had the filed divorce petition and the emergency court order in a thick manila envelope. The plan was simple. Carl would knock on the door, serve Sarah, and hand over the court order stipulating that Todd had to vacate the premises immediately, and Sarah had 48 hours to pack her personal belongings and leave. I parked my car at the end of the block, keeping the engine running, watching through the rain-streaked windshield as Carl walked up my driveway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I saw him ring the doorbell. A moment later, the front door opened. I couldn't see who answered it, but Carl stood there for a few seconds, handed over the paperwork, spoke briefly, and then walked back down the driveway toward his truck. He gave me a brief nod as he drove past. It was done. I waited exactly 10 minutes to give the reality of the situation time to sink in. Then I pulled my car into the driveway, blocking both Todd's BMW and Sarah's SUV. I got out of the car, pulled my shoulders back, and walked up the steps of my home. When I opened the front door, the atmosphere inside was completely different from the quiet silence of Tuesday afternoon. The air felt heavy, charged with panic and toxic tension. Sarah was sitting on the stairs, the legal documents scattered around her feet like dead leaves. Her face was swollen from crying, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Todd was standing near the kitchen island, holding a half-packed duffel bag, looking wildly between Sarah and me as I walked into the foyer. "Mark," Sarah sobbed, stepping down the stairs toward me, her hands reaching out. "What is this? You're divorcing me? Exclusive possession? You're throwing me out of my own house?" I stood perfectly still, keeping my hands in my pockets. I didn't look at her face. I looked past her, straight at Todd. The rage that had been brewing inside me for 48 hours concentrated into a laser-focused beam. "Todd," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm, even to my own ears. "The court order in your wife's lap explicitly states you have zero legal right to be on this property. You have exactly 5 minutes to take whatever fits in that duffel bag and get out of my sight. If you are still here in 4 minutes and 59 seconds, I am calling the police to have you arrested for criminal trespassing. And believe me, I will press charges." Todd shifted his weight, trying to summon an ounce of the bravado he usually had when he was pitching a real estate deal. "Dude, come on, don't be like this. Let's talk about this rationally. I'm already leaving." 4 minutes, I said, pulling my phone out of my pocket and opening the keypad. "And if you ever look at my wife, my house, or my face again, the legal system is going to be the absolute least of your worries." Todd looked at me, then down at my phone, and finally over at Sarah. Whatever remaining courage he had completely evaporated. He didn't say another word. He picked up his duffel bag, zipped it with a sharp, aggressive jerk, and walked past me out the front door. He didn't look back. A moment later, I heard his BMW start up, the tires spinning slightly on the wet asphalt as he backed out of the driveway and sped away. The man who had been my best friend for over a decade left my life in a cloud of exhaust and wet gravel, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of wreckage. The front door clicked shut, and then it was just Sarah and me. She was still standing near the base of the stairs, trembling, her hands pressed against her face as she let out a jagged, broken breath. "How could you do this to me, Mark?" she whispered, looking up at me with a mixture of betrayal and raw desperation. After everything we've built, you're just gonna throw me out on the street like garbage? We made a mistake, okay? It was a horrible, stupid mistake. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling. Please, Mark, you can't just end our marriage in 48 hours through a lawyer. I looked around the foyer. I looked at the framed photos on the wall from our trip to Maui 2 years ago. I looked at the custom light fixtures we spent 3 weekends picking out together. It all felt like a movie set for a life that didn't belong to me anymore. A mistake is a typo, Sarah, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. A mistake is missing an exit on the highway. What you did was an operation. I spent the last 2 nights looking at the call logs. I saw the bank statements. I know about the boutique hotels downtown while I was working in Detroit. I know about the cash withdrawals. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice every single day for months to systematically dismantle the life we built while using my money to fund it. Her face went pale, the defensive anger draining out of her instantly as she realized the full scope of what I knew. She reached out, trying to grab my sleeve, but I stepped back, out of her reach. I loved you more than anything on this earth, I continued, the words heavy and metallic in my chest. I trusted him with my life. The 2 of you took the 2 highest forms of trust a human being can offer, the trust of a wife and the trust of a brother, and you dragged them through the dirt in my own bed. You have 48 hours to pack your clothes, your design equipment, and your personal items. On Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, the locks on this house are being changed. Anything left behind will be boxed up and sent to your parents' house in Ohio. What about Buster? She choked out, her tears smudging her mascara into dark streaks down her cheeks. Buster stays with me, I said flatly. You couldn't even manage to take care of a marriage while I was gone. You're not taking my dog. The next 48 hours were a blur of absolute agony and cold military execution. Sarah stayed in a hotel downtown that night, returning the next morning with a couple of her friends and a small rental truck, while I sat out in my car in the driveway, watching them carry boxes out of the front door. Every box that left the house felt like a pound of flesh being carved away from my soul, but I didn't shed a single tear. I couldn't. I had cried all the tears I had in the parking lot of that diner. Now there was only the task at hand. When 3 o'clock on Saturday arrived, the house was completely empty of her presence. The walls looked bare where her art prints used to hang. The master bedroom was stripped down to just the mattress and the heavy wooden frame. A locksmith arrived exactly on time, replacing every deadbolt and door handle on the exterior of the property. When he handed me the new set of heavy brass keys, a strange, suffocating weight finally lifted off my chest. It's been 3 months since that Tuesday afternoon. The divorce was finalized last week. Thanks to Arthur's relentless strategy and the digital mountain of evidence I provided, Sarah settled out of court. She didn't get a dime of my retirement, she didn't get alimony, and the house remains solely in my name. I sold her SUV to pay off the remaining balance on our shared credit cards and closed every single joint account we ever owned. As for Todd, word gets around fast in the Chicago real estate community. A few anonymous emails containing public court records and itemized timelines of his behavior under my roof found their way to the managing partners at his firm. He was quietly let go 3 weeks ago for performance issues. Last I heard, he moved back into his parents' basement in Columbus, his career in ruins and his reputation permanently stained. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is completely quiet and the city traffic is just a faint murmur in the distance, I sit on the back porch with Buster. I look out over the dark yard, holding a glass of whiskey, and I wonder how a human being survives having their entire reality rewritten in a single second. I look at the empty space on the couch where my best friend used to sit, and the empty side of the bed where my wife used to sleep. The pain doesn't go away, but it changes. It stops being a sharp, bleeding wound and turns into a dull, heavy scar. I'm 32 years old, and my life has completely reset to zero. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at another person and fully trust them again. I don't know if I'll ever let someone else sleep under my roof. But as I look down at Buster, who is fast asleep with his head resting on my shoe, I know one thing for certain. The house is empty. The quiet is deafening. But for the first time in a very long time, the air in this home is completely clean.